I posted an introduction to the movie Disclosure, which I hope you looked at before watching the movie Disclosure. But I want to at least review a few things about why we're using the movie Disclosure as a tool for studying ethics. What is its value? And then, first of all, the question that you should have asked yourself was, what's the ethical problem that's raised in the movie Disclosure that we're talking about? Right? What is the ethical problem? And some of you should, if I actually ask you to write about this, you might have heard about the Me Too movement. You might have heard about Harvey Weinstein. You might have heard about some other individuals who've been prominent in the news lately. Depending on when you're listening to this, it might not be so late, finally, when you're hearing of it. But it's become an issue. The issue raised has to do with sexual harassment. And it's become something that, it has been a pervasive, meaning it's been all very widespread, but only recently have we heard it. We've heard it in cases of the examination of nominees for the Supreme Court, et cetera, that it's come up. So the ethical problem, figure out what exactly is the ethical problem that we're talking about. Now think about it. Why would, in what ways is a movie like Disclosure a useful tool for studying an ethical problem? And I think it's a useful tool because many people have not really experienced sexual harassment, seen sexual harassment, or thought about sexual harassment in any kind of detailed, objective way, which we should be doing it in a course in applied ethics. And it's useful because while it is not factual and much of it is dramatized, it represents things that actually have gone on and are prevalent. And in what way is it kind of an interesting way, a useful tool? I think this particular movie, based on Michael Crichton's book by the same name, raises the problem kind of from the other perspective. That is typically, and we'll see that sexual harassment is thought of something that typically happens to women, and it's inflicted upon them by men. And what's interesting about Disclosure is that there's a role reversal. Now, if we were watching this when the movie first came out, it would have been a little bit different because nobody would have ever thought about it, sexual harassment as something that a woman was applying to a man. And it also, as a result of that, it lets you examine what you think about it and maybe what you should think about it. And now think about, in what ways is a movie like Disclosure problematic for studying an ethical problem? And I think in what ways it's problematic is, number one, sometimes the visual media leads people to, they have an emotional response to it. Seeing what's going on, they have an immediate emotional response, and they don't think clearly about it oftentimes. And furthermore, it's a contrived situation to some extent, although things like this, I'm sure, happen on a regular basis. The way they're presented in the movie, or in movies in general, is that there's a black and white, it's clear what's going on. And oftentimes in life, it's not quite that clear. But I think the thing that we want to do is we want to step back from it and think about, well, what is it that we can learn about this particular situation, and forget about the, tugging at your heart in a certain way. You're tugging at your emotions. What is this sexual harassment? How can it be? And how should we evaluate it from an ethical standpoint? And in fact, in Next question, what ways was disclosure particularly interesting as a case study? Well, I mentioned the role reversal from what ordinarily is the case, and even to some extent today, we even think of it more as predominantly male on female. It is inflicted by males on females, but we see that that's not quite true, and especially as the Me Too movement became more critical, and as there were some issues brought up with some Supreme Court nominees, we began to see that we have to really examine the whole problem a little bit more closely. Okay, now let's talk about things that I asked you to do, things you should have thought about. That is, when you're watching the movie, you should have list the acts of sexual harassment in the movie. In fact, I should have had a contest maybe for the students to list the greatest number of that. Now, I wanted you to sit back, and here's the purpose of watching it in a movie. What makes these cases, I'm not talking about right or wrong here, what about them makes them sexual harassment? Now, here's the question. A lot of things that we talk about in business ethics and in applied ethics in general, oftentimes they are actual crimes that are being committed, and we hope that our criminal code or our laws in general reflect the way things are from a moral standpoint. That is, we'd like to think that we have just laws. One question that we want to ask is, are all these actions crimes? And I wanted you to keep open in mind that maybe there are things that are morally wrong, but nonetheless are not criminal and maybe should not be criminal. The actions, are they illegal? Meaning sometimes we think of crimes, and typically you do think about crimes as being things that we have laws and we put people in jail. But there are two kinds of laws. We have criminal laws and we also have civil laws, things governing oftentimes our business relationships. That is, there are rules that you have to follow in society, but failing to follow them doesn't mean that you're going to go to jail, but it could very well mean that you're open to a lawsuit on that. So are these things crimes? Are they civil wrongs, torts as they call them? Yeah, and then finally we want to distinguish from crimes and things that are being illegal, things that are really morally wrong. Maybe morally right, although I don't think we'd have a lot of people defending any kind of harassment as being morally right. But here's the important question. Why are these morally wrong, these actions morally wrong? What about them makes them actually morally wrong? And maybe certain ones aren't morally wrong. Maybe they're just unpleasant, etc. Okay, and some of the questions I asked you to think about when you were watching the movie were the following. What makes actions morally right or morally wrong? Something we've been talking about. What about physical violence? What about, it should be a physically violent action makes it right or wrong? So let me change that right. What about physically violent, physical violence makes an action, it should say. Okay, makes an action right or wrong. Okay. Now, here's the important thing. What is a sexual assault? Of course, a main scene in the movie, there was something that might have been described as a sexual assault. Well, what makes something a sexual assault? And what is sexual harassment? Is it something different than a sexual assault? And how is it different? What's the difference between sexual assault and sexual harassment? Another question is, why is sexual harassment, and I'm not asking why is it a problem, why is it a moral problem, But why is it a moral problem about business? What about business makes sexual harassment a problem? And in fact, you might think, well, the business that I'm in is education, higher education, college education. In college education, there are things that could be considered sexual harassment, that some people would consider sexual harassment, that are, well, not illegal. And there are certain relationships, for instance, between a faculty member and a student who is subject to that faculty member. That's the business relationship that you have. Why? So the question is, why is sexual harassment a problem about business ethics in particular, as opposed to just, normally social ethics or something? Why is sexual harassment a moral issue? Why is sexual harassment a business issue, right? And then to think about something which is really an important distinction. It's been sitting out in the background in some of the other questions. What's the difference between a morally acceptable sexual act and rape? What is the difference between those two? Okay, now these were a set of questions that I wanted you to think about. Think about them again as you're watching this, and we're going to go and delve in a little bit more deeply to try to do a little bit of analysis to figure out the answers to certain and distinctions that we want to make and answers to some of these questions that are going to help us figure out what makes sexual harassment right or wrong.